I remember the way the air felt that night. Thick, unmoving, almost heavy enough to warn me. I was standing alone in my kitchen, the overhead light flickering just enough to make the whole room feel off, when the truth I had been trying to outrun finally caught up with me. My hands were still trembling, and I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the hum of the refrigerator, like my body knew before my mind fully did. If you've ever had a moment where everything you trusted suddenly felt wrong, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. You'll understand why this one still sits in my chest. Because in that quiet, breathless moment, something inside me shifted, and I didn't know it yet. But that was the moment everything started to unravel. I never expected my day to shatter the way it did. One moment I was moving through my routine, trying to keep life steady, and the next, I felt this cold, sinking weight hit me so hard it almost took the air out of my chest. It was that kind of shock that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, uninvited, and suddenly every instinct you have is on high alert. I remember standing there, frozen, trying to understand how something so close to me could twist so quickly. My mind kept racing, replaying tiny moments I had brushed off, wondering how I missed the signs. That was the part that stung the most, realizing the danger had been sitting quietly in the room long before I noticed it. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt that uneasy tightness in my chest, the kind that warns you that you're about to be pulled into something far bigger than you're ready for. In that moment, it wasn't just fear, it was betrayal. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that hits harder because it feels personal. I could almost hear my own thoughts whispering that something wasn't right, that someone I trusted had crossed a line I didn't even think they were capable of crossing. And as that realization settled in, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief rise up, sharp and hot, like it needed an outlet but had nowhere to go. I didn't have answers. Not then. All I had was that heavy truth pressing against me, telling me that whatever came next wasn't going to be simple. I knew I had to brace myself. I knew I had to be ready for a fight I didn't ask for. And even though I didn't fully understand the shape of the threat yet, I could feel it closing in, piece by piece. That was the moment everything changed for me. The moment I realized I couldn't ignore the past anymore. And to explain how I ended up standing in that storm, I need to take you back. Back to when the first cracks started forming. Long before I realized they were there at all. When I look back on everything that brought us to this point, I always start with my daughter. She has been the center of my world from the moment I first held her. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, built on long nights of worry, small victories that kept us going, and this quiet, stubborn love that carried us through every rough season. I worked hard to give her stability, even when I felt unsteady myself. And through it all, she grew into someone gentle, bright, and far more trusting than the world often deserved. I remember the way she used to come to me with every fear and every dream, the way she would lean on me when life felt heavy. Those memories stay with me, not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. They were the moments that shaped who we became together. I tried to shield her from the harsher edges of life, maybe a little too much at times, but I never wanted her to feel alone the way I once did. She deserved softness. She deserved safety. So when someone new stepped into her world, I paid attention, not out of suspicion at first, but out of habit, out of that protective instinct I could never quite turn off. I watched her light up, watched her believe she had finally found someone who saw her the way she saw others, and I remember feeling this mix of hope and hesitation. Hope, because I wanted her to have something beautiful. Hesitation, because I knew how vulnerable a good heart can be in the wrong hands. There were little things that didn't fit, though nothing sharp enough to call a warning yet. Just small shifts in her energy, small changes in how she spoke about her days, small pauses she didn't used to have. I told myself she was growing, that she was learning to stand on her own, that maybe I needed to let her make space for someone else. But deep down, a quiet ache had started to settle in, the kind that comes from sensing a storm before you can see the clouds. And that feeling kept growing. Even as I tried to stay supportive, even as I reminded myself to trust her choices, something wouldn't let me rest. I couldn't name it then, but I could feel it. Something in the present didn't match the foundation we had built, and I knew I needed to pay attention before those early tremors became something impossible to ignore. It started gradually, almost quietly, the way a house settles at night, and you can't tell if the sound came from the walls or your own imagination. After all the warmth and hope I tried to hold on to, there came this slow shift, something small enough that I almost brushed it aside. But it stayed with me. I noticed how my daughter's energy dimmed in ways she tried to hide. She moved differently, spoke differently, carried herself with this new hesitance that didn't match the bright, steady person she had always been. At first, I tried to tell myself she was just adjusting to a serious relationship, figuring out how to balance her life with someone else's presence. But the more time passed, the more those little inconsistencies began to stack up. He had a way of stepping into conversations and steering them back to himself. A way of making her feel like she needed to check in with him before making even the smallest decision. And a way of smiling that never seemed to reach his eyes whenever I came around. None of it was loud or dramatic. It was all in the margins, where harm often hides. She would share pieces of her day that didn't add up to the version he later presented. Or she would mention something she wanted, only to quietly backtrack the next time I saw her. I kept thinking about the way she used to move through life with her own rhythm, steady and confident. And now she seemed to be sinking herself to someone else's pace, someone who kept tightening the circle around her without ever calling it control. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, tried to believe I was overthinking things out of habit. There were moments when I questioned my own instincts, wondering if I was letting old fears speak louder than the present. But every time I tried to dismiss my concerns, something new would catch my attention. Some subtle shift in how she looked at me, or how quickly she would jump to defend him even when I hadn't said anything critical. It was as if she was guarding his image, not because anyone asked her to, but because she felt she needed to. The tension kept growing inside me, a quiet pressure that I couldn't shake. It wasn't one big incident. It was the accumulation of small ones, each one nudging me closer to the realization that something was unfolding beneath the surface, something I couldn't ignore any longer. And with every passing day, I could feel myself edging toward a moment where everything would come crashing into the open. Whatever was happening, whatever truth had been hiding in the corners, I knew I was getting dangerously close to finding it. It all came apart on a quiet evening that should have felt ordinary. I remember standing in the hallway, feeling that same pressure in my chest that had been building for weeks, and knowing I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something pulled me forward, something heavier than fear, but sharper than doubt. And when I stepped into that room, the truth hit me so fast, it felt like the air was knocked out of my body. Everything I had tried to piece together suddenly aligned in one brutal, undeniable moment. I saw the way he hovered over my daughter, not with care, but with ownership. I saw the way she tensed before she even realized I was there, as if bracing for a reaction she had learned to anticipate. And I saw the look he gave her, a quiet warning wrapped in a smile that told me exactly who he really was. In that instant, every red flag I had tried to rationalize turned into a bright, blinding signal. There was no misreading it anymore, no explaining it away. The truth was standing right in front of me. My whole body reacted before my mind could catch up. It felt like heartbreak and fury collided inside me at the same time, leaving me shaking with the weight of it. I had spent so long trying to give her space, trying to believe she was safe, trying to trust that my instincts were wrong. But seeing her shrink into herself while he stood there with that calm, calculating expression shattered all of that in an instant. It was the kind of clarity that hurts more than the confusion ever did. As I stood there, everything inside me shifted. The fear, the hesitation, the second guessing, it all burned away. What took its place was something steadier and far more certain. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't stay quiet or hope things would work themselves out. I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew I had to act. That moment marked the line between suspicion and truth, and once I crossed it, there was no going back. I took a breath, steadying myself, feeling my resolve lock into place. Whatever came next, whatever it would cost, I had to confront what was happening, and I had to do it now. The shock settled in me like a weight, but instead of crushing me, it held me still. I remember walking into the kitchen and letting the quiet wrap around me, listening to the hum of the refrigerator as if it were the only thing anchoring me to the moment. My hands were trembling at first, but the longer I stood there, the more the trembling faded. The chaos inside me began to cool, turning into something sharper and more focused than fear. I replayed what I had seen, not to torture myself, but to understand it with clear eyes. Every small hesitation from my daughter, every strange shift in his tone, every moment I had brushed aside because I wanted to believe she was safe. They all lined up now in a straight, undeniable line. It hurt in a deep, steady way, but the pain was no longer frantic. It was guiding me. It was reminding me of every instinct I had ignored and every lesson I had learned the hard way over the years. I sat at the table for a while, letting the memories settle into place. I thought about the times I had pushed through fear before, the moments when I had been forced to choose between comfort and doing what was right. Those memories didn't roar at me. They whispered, reminding me that resolve doesn't always come from rage. Sometimes it comes from quiet certainty. In that stillness, I started noticing things I had overlooked, his patterns, his timing, the way he isolated her in subtle ways. I didn't rush toward any decisions. I let the clarity form on its own. It felt like watching dust float in sunlight, slow, quiet, undeniable. And somewhere in that silence, my next steps began to take shape. Not grand gestures, not impulsive reactions, just a steady plan built on truth. By the time I stood up, something in me had settled for good. The fear was still there, but it no longer dictated anything. What guided me now was the simple understanding that I had to act. I had to protect her, and I finally felt ready to move toward whatever came next. I moved through the house with a kind of careful intention, noticing details I had ignored before. The way his shoes were placed near the door. The way my daughter's jacket hung on the back of a chair instead of in her closet. Small things, but they painted a picture I could finally see without emotion clouding it. I felt a quiet steadiness settling deeper into me. The kind that comes when you know a moment of truth is approaching and you're no longer running from it. I didn't rush anything. I simply paid attention. Every sound in the hallway, every shift in tone when they spoke to each other from another room, which I let wash over me like distant echoes of a story I already knew the ending to. I replayed my own thoughts too, reminding myself that clarity wasn't something I needed to force. It was something that would reveal itself if I created the space for it. I started arranging my afternoon in a way that felt almost instinctive. I stayed nearby, but with enough distance that I could observe without interfering. I kept my voice calm, my movements slow. Part of me felt like I was preparing for a storm, not by boarding up the windows, but by standing still and waiting for the first drop of rain. It was a different kind of readiness, quiet, deliberate, grounded. I noticed how he kept glancing at his phone and then quickly tucking it away, as if hiding the light from the screen would erase the action itself. I noticed how my daughter avoided eye contact, her shoulders tight, her voice a little too soft. Those tiny shifts told me more than any confrontation ever could. Something was unfolding whether I spoke or not. As the daylight shifted through the windows, I felt the tension in the house tightening like a cord. I moved to the edge of the living room, letting the stillness settle around me. I could feel my heartbeat steady, not frantic like before, but purposeful. I knew I was standing on the threshold of the moment I had been preparing for, and all that was left was to step fully into it. When we stepped into that crowded room, I felt the shift almost immediately. The air had that strange heaviness that shows up when too many truths are pressing against the walls at the same time. I watched him try to hold himself together, smoothing his expression, straightening his shoulders, acting like nothing was wrong. But the cracks showed faster than I expected. His hands trembled when someone asked a harmless question. His smile twitched at the edges. My daughter stayed close to him, but I could feel how tense she was, how unsure. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I just watched the performance unravel piece by piece. It was almost surreal, seeing the same behaviors that had played out behind closed doors suddenly spill into a room full of people who weren't used to pretending. He snapped at a comment that wasn't directed at him. He stumbled over simple explanations. His defensiveness arrived before anyone even looked his way. Eyes started shifting around us. Small glances passed between relatives, friends, neighbors. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone felt the same thing. Something was off. My heart pounded, not from fear anymore, but from the clarity of it all. I could see the moment he realized he was losing control. His voice rose, his posture tightened, and the polished image he depended on simply collapsed in front of everyone. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness watching it happen, knowing that the truth I had carried alone was now exposed under bright lights. By the time the room fell into that confused, uncomfortable quiet, I knew there was no going back. Whatever came next would cut deeper, and I could feel myself bracing for it, knowing the real emotional fallout was still ahead of us. When the room finally emptied and the noise faded, the silence felt almost too sharp to breathe in. My body was still humming from everything I had just witnessed, but the real weight settled the moment I saw my daughter's face. All that confusion, all that fear she had been holding back in front of everyone, broke the second we were alone. Her shoulders trembled, and I could see the collapse happening in slow motion, like her entire world had been knocked off its foundation. I felt my own emotions crashing into each other. Relief that the truth was finally visible. Grief for the pain she was feeling. Anger at how long he had twisted things. And a fierce instinct to protect her from whatever came next. My mind kept replaying the scene, each moment sharper than the last. The way he lost control. The way people looked at us. The way everything I had tried to warn her about stood there in plain sight. It should have felt like vindication, and in a small way it did, but mostly it felt heavy and sad. I sat with her through those waves of hurt, staying quiet, letting her feel what she needed to feel. Inside, I was trying to steady myself too. Part of me was furious, part of me was exhausted, and part of me just wanted to gather every broken piece and help her rebuild. I realized then how much this moment would define the road ahead for both of us. There was no pretending anymore, no uncertainty, no holding back. When her breathing finally slowed and the shaking eased, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief exactly, but a quiet readiness, an understanding that this was the turning point. Everything had fallen apart, but now we could start to move towards something better. I didn't know exactly what the next steps would look like, but I could feel myself preparing to take them. In the quiet that followed the fallout, I thought I finally understood everything. I told myself the worst was over, that the truth had already torn through the room and left nothing else to uncover. But as the hours passed and I replayed every moment in my mind, a different pattern started to emerge, one that made the back of my neck tighten. It was the kind of realization that doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in, slow and deliberate, until you can't ignore it anymore. I began noticing the smaller pieces that never fit before. His strange insistence on managing her accounts. His sudden interest in decisions that had nothing to do with him. The subtle pressure he kept placing on her to disconnect from people who cared about her. At first, I had written those things off as insecurity or immaturity, but in the aftermath, those fragments sharpened into something much darker. It wasn't just manipulation. It wasn't just control. There was a goal behind it. Something he had been steering her toward while making sure I never saw the full picture. When the final detail clicked, a financial document she didn't remember approving, tucked inside her bag like an afterthought, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. He hadn't just been trying to isolate her emotionally. He had been trying to position himself to take something from her. Something real. something that explained the desperation I saw in him when everything fell apart. This wasn't about love. It was about access. It was about leverage. It was about using her trust as a doorway. The shock came first, sharp and breathless. Then came the anger, heavier and deeper than before. But beneath all of that was a steadier understanding, a recognition that the conflict was never just between him and me. There was a larger force behind his choices, a pressure, a motive, maybe even people influencing him that I had been too focused on the surface to see. Whatever had pushed him this far wasn't finished, and I could feel it reaching into our lives even now. By the time the realization settled fully, the fear was gone. What replaced it was a calm, deliberate awareness that the real fight hadn't even started yet. I wasn't just protecting my daughter from one person. I was stepping into something bigger, something that required more than intuition and hope. And as that truth crystallized, I felt myself brace for what was coming next, knowing the real threat was finally stepping into view. I felt the shift the moment I understood he wasn't acting alone. Everything he'd done, the manipulation, the isolation, the pressure to control her life, was only the surface. The real force behind it all waited just beyond that line. The kind of presence you don't see until you're forced to look straight at it. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I followed the trail he left behind, the small details he never meant to expose, financial ties that didn't make sense, messages that hinted at someone else pulling the strings, decisions he made that were far too strategic for someone who could barely hold his own story together. As I pieced it together, I realized I was dealing with something larger, more calculated, and far more dangerous than a desperate young man looking for an easy way out. There was intention behind all of it. By the time I confronted the source, whether it was a person, an organization, or a pattern of influence that had been grooming him long before he met my daughter, I felt my fear rise like a pulse in my throat. But I didn't back down. I stepped into that moment with every truth I had gathered, every instinct that had carried me this far, and every ounce of strength I'd been saving for when the real enemy finally showed its face. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. Standing in front of that force, I felt the weight of what I was up against. I felt the pressure of knowing how close we'd come to losing everything. Most of all, I felt the clarity that had been missing for months. This was the heart of the storm. This was what had been reaching into my daughter's life and twisting it from the shadows. As I confronted it, I could feel something harden inside me, a quiet resolve that didn't shake, no matter how intimidating the truth was. I realized this wasn't just about protecting her from one person. It was about breaking the grip of something that had nearly consumed her future. And even as I stood there, facing the weight of that threat, I knew this moment wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a longer, more complicated fight. In the days that followed, I felt myself settling into a quieter space, almost like my mind was trying to relearn what it meant to breathe without bracing for impact. The confrontation had stripped away the last of the confusion, but it also left behind a kind of emotional debris I had to sort through piece by piece. I wasn't rushing anything. I didn't have the energy to. Instead, I found myself moving slowly, paying attention to the smallest signals, moments where my shoulders relaxed, or where a thought passed through my mind without carrying a sting. I kept replaying everything I'd learned, not to punish myself, but to understand how I had gotten pulled so deep into it all. I recognized the places where fear had clouded my judgment, and where love had made me hold on longer than I should have. But I also saw the strength I had shown, even when my voice shook, and that mattered. That was where the real healing started. I spent time grounding myself in familiar things, quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, long walks where I let my thoughts drift without forcing any meaning, small routines that reminded me I was still here, still capable, still steady enough to keep going. I noticed how the heaviness began to lift, not all at once, but in thin layers that peeled away with each honest moment I gave myself. Every time I acknowledged the hurt without letting it control me, I felt something inside me rebuild. There was a turning point I didn't even recognize at first. It came on a simple afternoon when I realized I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't flinching at shadows or second-guessing every instinct. I just felt present, clear, like I had finally stepped back into my own life after being pushed to the edges of it for far too long. Even though the road ahead was still long, I could sense that I'd crossed a threshold. I felt more grounded than I had in months, and for the first time in a while, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like something I could walk into with my head held steady. And in that quiet shift, I knew I was finally moving toward the resolution I'd been searching for. Somewhere in the middle of putting myself back together, I realized I wasn't just healing from what happened. I was changing because of it. There was a moment when I caught myself thinking about all the signs I had ignored, all the ways I had doubted my own instincts, and instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt determined. I knew I couldn't go back to the person who kept quiet to keep the peace. I couldn't shrink myself just to fit into someone else's version of calm. What I went through had carved out a kind of clarity I couldn't ignore anymore. It hit me that my journey wasn't meant to end with me simply standing back on my feet. There was a larger purpose waiting on the other side of all this pain. I started seeing how many people move through situations like mine with no support, no validation, no one telling them they're not imagining things. And in that realization, something in me sparked. My experience became more than just something I survived. It became something I could use. I found myself wanting to speak up, to guide others through the fog I had walked through alone. Maybe it meant sharing my story so someone else would trust their instincts sooner. Maybe it meant becoming the steady voice I desperately needed when everything around me was shaking. Whatever shape it took, I knew I wasn't meant to stay silent anymore. The more I leaned into that purpose, the more direction I felt. My pain wasn't just a wound, it was fuel. It pushed me towards something wider, something meaningful, something that stretched far beyond my own healing. And as that intention took root, I felt myself stepping into a new chapter, one defined by choice, clarity, and impact, leading me toward the final understanding of what this entire journey was meant to teach me.